We're going to start. First of all, I acknowledge the elders, past, present, and emerging of the Indigenous people of the Canberra area, and Ngunnawal and Ngambri, and there are other groups that have been recognised recently as having rights over our land, and we recognise that their sovereignty has never been ceded. And I should also mention that this is a webinar, someone should tell me, not a dual thing, so the people online, we can't see them, but they can see us and they can ask questions later. And there's quite a few people online, so welcome to them as well. Welcome especially to Nic Maclellan. We were just saying, Nic and I, how the French Pacific sort of floats out somewhere out on the periphery of the vision of most of us interested in the Pacific. And yet, of course, the French role in the Pacific in terms of asserting sovereignty over Pacific peoples goes back way before Germany and England and Australia, and seems likely to persist far longer than we can think about even now. Nic is an ideal person to talk about issues in the French Pacific, having been involved in work on those areas for many years. He says as an independent journalist, but I'd call him an independent researcher. He does deep research, looking way beyond the sort of interviews that you would expect of a journalist, publishing widely in peer-reviewed journals and books, and would be, I think, the best informed person in Australia on the issues that we're interested in. And Caledonia is an incredibly important issue for us to think about, with many parallels, of course, to Bougainville, both a strong movement for secession and large-scale mining, intermingling, and referendums for independence. So I think there's much to learn from what's happening in New Caledonia. Nic, over to you.
Thank you, Anthony, and thank you to the Department of Pacific Affairs for the invitation to speak today. I too want to acknowledge we're on the land of the Nationale and Ngambri people, Aboriginal land that was never ceded. Although I have written widely and can do footnotes, I am actually a journalist. I come back from New Caledonia recently and been doing a lot of interviews in the lead up to the 25th anniversary of the Noumea Accord, 5th of May 1998. The French state supporters and opponents of independence signed a framework agreement. We are literally 25 years later this month, and it's an important time not only to assess quickly what's happened, but what's coming next, because the transition established by the Noumea Accord was to culminate in a referendum, or more than one referendum, on self-determination. There have been 3 votes between 2018 and 2021, and there are currently talks underway about what comes next. So I want to focus on that today. Also want to connect it to Australian politics in the region and in relationship with France, simply because times are changing pretty fast, and I'll highlight some of the reasons for that. I'll keep it short about the Noumea Accord because many of you have probably read about it or thought about it in the past. After the conflict of the mid-1980s, the Matignon and Oudinot Accords of 1988 ended the conflict, set out a transition period. But it was agreed in the late 90s that there was a time to look forward again. And so the French government, Prime Minister Lionel Jospin in the middle there, signed an agreement with the FLNKS, the Kanak Socialist National Liberation Front, and on the right of this photo, Jacques Lafleur, the leader of what was then called the RPCR, the Conservative and the Independence Party, that instead of holding a referendum on New Caledonia's political status and possible independence, they put off that referendum for a transition over 20 to 25 years, create new political institutions, and systematically under the Noumea Accord transfer powers from the government of France to the new government of New Caledonia. And over time that happened in areas around health and education and so on. The French state would retain the compétences régaliennes, the sovereign powers around defence, foreign policy, currency, and so on. Within French law, this is a quite unique agreement in that it created a New Caledonian citizenship that is distinct from French nationality. And there was a recognition of the Kanak people, quite unique in French jurisprudence, where everyone is a French citizen, whether you live in any of the overseas collectivities. So there is no recognition, for example, of the Corsican people or the Maori people of French Polynesia, but the Kanak people as a people, a nation in waiting, is recognized in this process. Central to it also was measures of economic and social rebalancing. And in many ways, that's been a key feature of the process over the last 25 years. The political ecology of New Caledonia has been transformed in many ways. For more than a century, there was a major nickel smelter run by Eramet Société de Nickel in Noumea, the capital. This is the Koniambo smelter, new smelter in the northern province, administered by pro-independence parties. There's a third smelter in the south, at Goro, currently run by Prony Resources. Won't go into all the details of this, but there's been massive transformation of this central industry, with New Caledonia holding massive reserves of nickel, and indeed looking forward to the El Dorado that people perceive in the 2030s because of the strategic importance of nickel, not only for weapons, but for electric vehicles. So there's an economic resource for New Caledonia to play on the global stage that many other small island developing states don't have. Despite that wealth, all three of the smelters are facing economic difficulties with significant debt burdens. And in Noumea recently, I spoke with Alcide Ponga, who's mayor of Kwawa in the north. He's leader of the Conservative Rassemblement Party at the moment. And he talked about, nickel being central to New Caledonia's well-being. But as he says, we know that the nickel industry is in trouble. The issue is not the number of smelters, whether they can all keep operating to get into the 2030s, but whether they're profitable. And things have been through difficult times in recent years because of competition with Indonesia as a major nickel ore producer, debt levels within the smelters, speculation, financial speculation in the nickel industry globally, and so on. And times are tough for many ordinary people in New Caledonia, even after 25 years of economic reform and so-called rebalancing between the wealthy south and the capital and the two provinces in the north and Loyalty Islands. COVID hit everyone. Here's a graph from the Statistics Office in Noumea about the way in which tourism was affected. And as you can see, as it occurred in many places around the Pacific, it fell off a cliff at the beginning of 2020 and is only about 2/3 of the way rebuilding as cruise ships come back to New Caledonia. Unlike, say, French Polynesia, tourism is not central to the economy. The mining industry, manufacturing and other areas is important, but it just gives an idea of some of the economic burdens facing people. And one of the problems too is that New Caledonia is an incredibly unequal society between people who live in the city and urban and rural populations, between Kanak, Indigenous Kanak and other communities. Time's short, so I won't go into that, but it sets the frame for the other area, because there's been relative success in diversifying and so-called rebalancing the economy. The politics hasn't worked quite as well. There have been many successes. One of the features of the Noumea Accord was to create new political institutions. So the decentralisation of powers through 3 provincial assemblies in the north, south, Loyalty Islands, a Congress, 54-member Congress to set national policy with a multi-party government of 11 members above that, the creation of a new Kanak customary Senate. Australia is looking at a voice to Parliament. New Caledonia beat us to it a while ago. They have an advisory body of Indigenous elders who can review legislation related to Kanak identity and culture. That's been going for many years in New Caledonia. Politically, things have been successful in the sense that every 5 years since 1999, there have been elections to the assemblies and the Congress. The next one's scheduled in May next year, and those institutions are well bedded down. But the idea of the multi-party government was that through constitutional framing, it would bring together supporters and opponents of independence to work together. And that is at an impasse at the moment. For more than 20 years, the governments of New Caledonia have been led by a conservative anti-independence leader. And the government has always been split 7-4, 6-5, with a majority held by the opponents of independence, a range of conservative parties that have grown out of RPCR from the 20th century. Since July last year, however, that's been reversed, and we have a pro-independence government for the first time in 40 years in New Caledonia, a majority at least. As mentioned, there were 3 referendums, and I'll come back to these, in 2018, 2020, and more controversially in 2021, to determine the transfer of sovereign powers and New Caledonia's final political status. Well, it isn't final, and I'll go into that as we continue. The point being that under the Noumea Accord, signed in 1998, if after these referendums there was a no vote successively, then the signatories must come back to discuss the future political status. What I want to do today is to highlight those discussions. And while I was in New Caledonia, I met with people before and after they went to Paris for talks, which is very interesting. And I want to draw on my journalistic skills by quoting people in their own words rather than mine. As mentioned, the government of New Caledonia, currently headed by Nic Maclellan, pictured here, is the first pro-independence Kanak leader of a government since the early 1980s. Jean-Marie Chibal was vice president of the then council back in the 82 to 84. So it's been some time. And as you can see, that pro-independence parliamentary groups, UNI, UC FLNKS, have been joined by a new party, Éveil Océanien, Pacific Awakening, which is based on the Wallisian, Futunian and Tahitian communities, who make up 9 or 10% of the population, a significant voting bloc. And in an interesting shift, they are backing the government, so the numbers are 6-5, which is a significant change. There are 3 major political forces on the conservative side, the Loyaliste, Avenir en Confiance and Caledonia Ensemble. The government's not working very well because they're supposed to be a collegial government. The loyalists are finding themselves suddenly on the foot, having run the thing for 20 years and having a majority in the collegial decisions. They're now finding that the foot is, they're on the other foot, and they frankly don't like it, that they don't have a majority in the Congress or in the government. And it's quite a learning experience for people who've been in a significant position of power. And the swing vote comes from this small Wallisian party, Éveil Océanien. This is the leader, Milakula Tukumuli. Historically, Wallisians and Futunians who migrated to New Caledonia during the nickel boom of the late 60s, early 70s, their descendants now are New Caledonian born, and they're really trying to work out their place in this oceanic country. There's a significant shift, I would argue, groundswell, tectonic plates, and like all tectonic plates, it's moving pretty slowly. But I argue that there is a major change going on amongst New Caledonian-born non-Indigenous people about their place in the Southern Hemisphere. The EO's policy, the Éveil Océanien policy, is towards independence. No, not now. Logically, that means yes, later. And that's an historic shift for the Wallisians who, during the troubles of the 1980s, were acting as militias for the right. Having said that, although at parliamentary level there is this alliance, it hasn't translated into a majority for independence yet. I won't go into the details of the 3 referendums. I've written about this elsewhere if people are interested in chapter and verse. I think the key point to make is that the first referendum in 2018, there was a massive surge of support, unexpected, for the yes vote. Predictions at the time from all the smart money, the commentators, the pontificators, was that the independence movement would get 25 to 30%. I was in the French High Commission the night of counting and could see the faces of French officials and some of the pontificators who said that the Kanaks would have a strategic defeat as the vote mounted 20, 25, 30, 35, 40, 43% was a major shock to many people at the time. Having said that, the first vote was no to independence. The Noumea Accord set out a process that the Congress could ask for a second and even a third referendum on the basis of the no. Major turnout, over 80% for the first 2 votes, much higher than the turnout for elections, legislative elections and so on. As you can see, between the first and second vote, there was a small but significant increase and a momentum towards possibly a majority for yes. However, in mid-pandemic, there was disagreement about whether to proceed with the third referendum. The FLNKS and other pro-independence supporters called for it to be deferred until late 2022, after the French elections, after the legislative elections in 2022. The French state forged ahead, and the independence movement broadly called for non-participation, not a boycott. They didn't shut down the vote. Pro-independence mayors sat there opening the polling booths and waiting for people to come, and they didn't come. Turnout halved, and as you can see, only 3% people voted yes, 96% of no. Some academic commentators and news journalists who should know better think there's been this massive swing towards a no vote. It just misses the point that the affected, concerned population, as the United Nations calls them, the indigenous people by and large, didn't vote. And there's lots of graphics about why and so on. That's significant. And it was recognised at the time by the Pacific Islands Forum, which sent a ministerial mission. This is Ratwinoke Kumbumbula, former Fiji foreign minister. He travelled with Henry Puna, the Secretary General of the Forum, and Futuriela Saya, former Samoan United Nations ambassador, eminent diplomat. They monitored the 2018 referendum and the 2021 referendum. And the 2021 referendum, the report which was presented to forum leaders, said that they acknowledged this non-participation of the overwhelming majority of Indigenous people, and said that the result was an inaccurate representation of the will of people. And the report went on to criticise the credibility and legitimacy of the vote. This is still an issue of dispute today. The Conseil d'Etat, one of the French highest administrative courts in Paris, has ruled that legally, judicially, the vote was valid. Politically, however, the independence movement and its supporters, and indeed many international institutions, including the United Nations Special Committee on Decolonisation, says you can't really have a decision on self-determination that doesn't involve the colonised people. So politically, if not legally, this has been contested. And in the discussions that have been held between the French government and the independence movement and anti-independence parties over recent months, this issue is still contested about the validity of the vote. The other thing that people say, claiming a 90%, 96% victory, is the Noumea Accord is over. The Noumea Accord transition is over. Once again, that's not correct, legally or politically. And my source for that is the guy who wrote the Noumea Accord, Alain Krishna, the former High Commissioner, eminent public figure in France who's been involved in New Caledonia politics for decades and decades. And he's written recently that the Noumea Accord, I've summarised a much more complex situation, is essentially entrenched in the French Constitution. It has its own section of the French Constitution, and that's unique in French law and indeed in much international law. To change the Noumea Accord and the organic law which implemented it, you have to change the Constitution. That can involve a referendum in France or a meeting of both houses of the French Parliament, the National Assembly and the Senate, in what's called the Congress of Versailles, and they need a 3/5 majority. Quite a complex process. So Krisnak's analysis is that despite the 3 no votes, it's required to modify the French Constitution to create a new post-Noumea Accord political arrangement. And to do that will be complex. The current one, the current Noumea Accord, meanwhile, continues to apply. The Noumea Accord has not legally ended, but politically, there's a need to find another arrangement. And that's the situation that we're in at the moment. There's been a series of visits by France's overseas minister, who funnily is also Interior Minister. He's been very busy with the Interior, putting down the riots in France over domestic policy issues related to Macron's policies on pensions and retirement age. He and his delegate, Jean-François Karenko, have been visiting over the last 6 to 12 months to try and restart the dialogue required to come together in a tripartite way with the French state supporters and opponents of independence, as he says, to renew the dialogue and find a path forward for the future within the French Republic. Interesting change of rhetoric. For many years, the French state has said that they are neutral. It's up to New Caledonians to decide on their future, and that their role is simply to accompany people of New Caledonia to determine their political status. I've said many a time, and I repeat, that's nonsense. The French state has strategic interests in the region. The French state, as we know, has an Indo-Pacific strategy now that is very much reliant on its presence in overseas collectivities, French Polynesia, New Caledonia, Wallis and Futuna, La Réunion and other places. Don't have time to go into all that, but France has a horse in the race, to put it bluntly. And Darmanin is saying we want New Caledonia to remain within the French Republic. What can be put forward to achieve that? Interesting and complex discussion. The previous overseas minister, Sébastien Lecornu, after the 2021 referendum, set out an 18-month timetable to come to a decision on this political status. That was never going to happen because there were elections in France for the French presidency, the French legislature in early 2022, and everyone who I talked to during a visit in late 2021, the then president, Thierry Santa, the independence people all said, we're not going to come to a deal with anyone until we know who wins in France. If we're going to engage with the French state, we want to know who we're dealing with. So the Cornu's timetable was tossed aside. The FLNKS has also said, we don't want trilateral negotiations. We want to talk with the French government first, because our demand remains, we want to transition to an independent and sovereign state. And there are variations of that within the independence movement about timing and process, which I don't have time to go into. But the bottom line is that the official position of the FLNKS, reaffirmed at a Congress in January this year, is they want to negotiate with France about a transition to independence and sovereignty. Naturally, the anti-independence parties, the Loyalists, don't agree. They've called for trilateral negotiations rather than this bilateral discussions between France and the two contending camps. The Loyalists also say very clearly that they want New Caledonia to remain within the French Republic, and they want changes particularly to the electoral system, the complex electoral system, which has meant that only New Caledonian citizens, rather than all French nationals, can vote for the local political institutions. It's been one of the unique features of the Noumea Accord that there are residency requirements. Once again, complex, I won't go into the detail, but not everyone who lives in New Caledonia can vote for the local assemblies or local congress. And we're not talking about small numbers, around 40,000 plus people currently who are French nationals can't vote for the local institutions. And loyalist leaders like Madame Sonia Bacchus, who's both the president of New Caledonia Southern Province and a minister in the current French government, has called for, firstly, an opening up of the electoral rolls, something the FLNKS is very resistant to. And she also wants trilateral talks, saying, quote, we've reached the end of the bilateral process. We must manage to talk to each other as people who live in New Caledonia. We can't leave it to the French state to act as the interlocutor between us. There were meetings in Paris in April. They were bilateral with the FLNKS talking with the French government, the loyalists, 3 loyalist groupings talking with the French government, but no trilateral talks. And to the best of my knowledge, I'm happy to be corrected, there doesn't look like much movement on that. Monsieur Darmanin is travelling on the 1st of June back to Noumea to continue the process of trying to woo people together. We'll see. I spoke to Roch Womiton, who's currently the Speaker, President of New Caledonia's Congress, leading long-time independence leader. He was in the photo back in 1998, signing the agreement, pictured here with the moustache in the centre of the photo, just before he went to Paris. He said, well, look, they've set this timetable. Darmanin's going to talk with us. We're going to come together to agree on a new status. President Macron might come in July. We'll have it all sorted out by September this year. And then in January, February next year, they can hold the Congress of Versailles to change the constitution. Done and dusted, we'll have a new political status. Womiton said on the record, well, no, we don't accept their timetable. And if we need to keep talking for another year, well, let's keep talking for another year. They can't just impose whatever they like on us. And also, political parties in France will only support the change if it's preceded by a political agreement here in New Caledonia. We're happy to talk to them, but to talk seriously. The reference to the political parties in France, during legislative elections last June, Emmanuel Macron lost the majority in the National Assembly, a strong grouping on the left, La France Insoumise, and a coalition of small left parties, including the old Socialist Party. On the extreme right, the Rassemblement Nationale, Marine Le Pen, polled relatively well. And although Macron won his bid for the presidency for re-election in April, he doesn't have a strong majority in the parliament senatorial elections later on. And the left has said, well, we're not going to accept a deal unless everyone's happy with the deal. And yet there aren't these trilateral talks. So there's a bit of an impasse at the moment. We'll see what comes. All of this, of course, is happening at a time of incredible geopolitical contest and competition. Anyone who's read the papers will know that there's supposed to be a summit on the 22nd of May, except the US president's not coming. The geopolitical contest between China and the United States frames a lot of discussion. This is President Macron, Sydney Harbour, May 2018. He came to Sydney, he came to New Caledonia, and announced at the time, surrounded by French-made armaments from Thales and other companies operating in Australia, an Indo-Pacific axis, an India, Australia, France axis. New Caledonia, of course, being the pivot of this axis in the region. So France has presented itself and continues to do so as almost an autonomous force between the two major powers, the United States and China. Macron was recently in Beijing talking about strategic autonomy, that France saw itself almost on behalf of the European Union, though some European countries don't agree, as a separate force within the region. But it's very much driven by this arrangement. Unfortunately, as we know, it was also, however, disrupted by the AUKUS announcement and the breaching of the submarine contract with Australia, a $90 billion contract. And I think that arms sales for France is a major pillar in its Indo-Pacific strategy. And that's where the AUKUS thing was such a major blow. And indeed, as we know, the French government at the time was very critical of then Prime Minister Scott Morrison for the way it's done. The Albanese government has been seeking to rebuild ties with Paris and has done so relatively successfully in a short time because of the AUKUS breach. One of the first trips that Prime Minister Albanese took after his election in May 2022 was to Europe, to the NATO summit in Spain, and he met with Macron in the Élysée Palace at the beginning of July last year. There's been a series of subsequent meetings. Defence Minister Richard Marles, Deputy Prime Minister, travelled to Brest to meet his French counterpart, Sébastien Lecornu, signed a long communiqué about cooperation at military, strategic, cyber technology and more. Then in January this year, there was what they call a 2+2 meeting. The two defence ministers, the two foreign ministers met in Paris. Once again, a long communiqué about rebuilding the strategic partnership between France and Australia that was ruptured by the AUKUS announcement. I'm not quite persuaded that the diplomatic bad blood has passed. It took to some people. There's still a wariness and hostility about Australia. But the Australian government's been working very hard to rebuild ties with Paris. One of the striking elements of it too is that the Labor Party keeps saying that, like Australia, France is a Pacific country. And many of the Indigenous people, and some non-Indigenous people I spoke to in the Noumea recently said, well, hang on, France is a European country. It's not a Pacific country. It has claims of sovereignty over countries in the Pacific, but those are contested and have been for decades. And indeed, that's the view not only of the independence movement, surprise, surprise, but of many neighbouring Melanesian countries. Leonard Lorimer, pictured here on the right, was an official guest at the FLNKS Congress in January, standing there with President Mapu. I think President Mapu wearing his hat as a member of the Party of Kanak Liberation rather than as President of New Caledonia. And Lorimer said quite clearly, when I spoke to him, New Caledonia is regarded as a non-self-governing territory. That's the United Nations jargon for a colony. And France is an administering power that has responsibilities because of that status. It's established and assumed those responsibilities under the Noumea Accord, and so we want to see France remain honest and faithful to its responsibilities. Lorimer was very clear that Melanesian countries in the MSG were very eager to engage with France on issues of common concern around the oceans, around climate, around development assistance, around humanitarian and disaster response. And indeed, we've seen France, as a member of the France Treaty, most active recently in March this year, providing assistance to Vanuatu after two cyclones hit Vanuatu in the first week of March. So Melanesian countries is not back to the 1980s, where the relation between France and others in the era of the Rainbow Warrior terrorism of 193 nuclear tests, that era has passed. But Melanesian nations, and indeed the Forum, continues to say that New Caledonia is a non-self-governing territory, and on that basis, France has ongoing responsibilities for decolonisation. And Fiji and Papua New Guinea, two MSG members, are both members of the UN Special Committee on Decolonisation. President Mapu also says their focus is about regional integration, coming together with the region. And I think that's a central theme that I'll just finish with before we go on to discussion. You know, he talks about self-determination as principles underneath the 2050 strategy. This is him meeting then Forum Chair Veronica Bainimarama at last year's Forum in there. Australia also recognises that this is an issue. Australia now, under the Labor government, has been very active in rebuilding links with the Forum, with member countries. Foreign Minister Penny Wong went to Papeete to open a consulate. Australia now has diplomatic relations in every Forum member country, from Niue right through. Pretty small operation in Papeete, but nonetheless, it's symbolically very important. And she just travelled in April to New Caledonia. Once again, a significant visit. First time an Australian Foreign Minister has given an address to the Congress of New Caledonia. And it was a major diplomatic measure on both sides, pictured here with the president. And I interviewed President Mapu about this, and he says very clearly, as New Caledonia, as the government of New Caledonia, we're eager to work with Australia, our great neighbour. And that distinction between France as a Pacific country and New Caledonia as a Pacific country is something that's a very important part of that, because he emphasises, while there are many areas where we could work together, I don't have the agility, the flexibility, or the means of an independent country to build ties in some areas, because we are not an independent country. We don't have the capacity and sovereignty of an independent nation. Prime Minister Wong was pretty reluctant to talk about the political status issues. She had a couple of lines in her speech to the Congress where she acknowledged that it's true, it is a complex and historic juncture as the post-Noumea Accord process plays out in coming months. But she says it's a matter for the people of New Caledonia and the French state, and we'll work with whoever. Interesting. An Australian foreign minister has never used the word decolonisation since 2011. I looked it up. And that was Kevin Rudd talking about the Western Sahara. The word decolonisation doesn't pass the lips of Australian foreign ministers. And that's a bit of a tension with some of our Melanesian neighbours particularly, and I think across the forum, where, you know, Australia is saying we're neutral. Now, I'm old-fashioned enough to think that Australia shouldn't be neutral on the question of decolonisation. You know, the United Nations has had several decades to eradicate colonialism. That is the official position of the UN General Assembly. Not, of course, of the UN Security Council, where there are still a number of colonial powers still there. So this issue is posed before us. And I spoke with Magali Tingal, who's been an FLNKS advocate lobbying at the UN with Special Committee on Decolonisation members, with the G77 and others, saying, well, both France and us as New Caledonians are pushing for greater involvement in the region, but not for the same reasons. France wants greater involvement based on its notion of an Indo-Pacific axis. We don't agree. We want our right to self-determination as a colonised people. So I think it's interesting that people are talking past each other. They're all saying, yes, we want regional integration, but on what basis? I think that's an issue. I interviewed Pat Conroy, our Minister for the Pacific, last year, and posed, wasn't this a tension that at a time Australia is trying to build links with France as a strategic partnership in the context of containing China in the Indo-Pacific region, and at the same time addressing the concerns and priorities of Pacific Island nations? And he says, as you can see, we want to do both, and we're confident we can do both at the same time. I'm a journalist, I'm allowed to editorialise. You know, there's an old Australian saying that if you can't ride two horses at once, you shouldn't be in the circus. That's my words, not Mr. Conroy's. So, you know, Australia is riding the French horse and the Melanesian Pacific horse at the same time. That works as long as the horses are going in the same direction. And if the horses diverge on their path, there are two options. You jump on one or other horse, or you fall flat in your face. At the moment, the two horses are sort of heading in the same direction, but will they diverge again, as they have done in the past, particularly during the 1980s, where the call for independence is there? Now, most commentators see Australia, France, New Caledonia working together in partnership. I looked for symbols, and what I really noticed was this picture. There was just Southern Cross military exercises in New Caledonia last month. Many countries, PNG, Fiji, Australia, and others joined the Southern Cross. They had a grand review afterwards. The thing that struck me in that photo, though, of the party of dignitaries acknowledging the review was the lack of Kanak political representatives. There's Madame Baques, French Minister for Citizenship, the French High Commissioner, Sonia Lagarde, the Mayor of Noumea, Pierre Frogier on the right with his sash as a French senator. Not one Kanak minister to be seen. So Australia has been putting out a lot of social media about how Australia and France are working together, Pacific's really involved and things like that. Yet this year is not only the 25th anniversary of the Noumea Accord, it's the 35th anniversary of the Noumea Massacre. People with long memories, they remember the culmination of the crisis of the armed conflict. Indeed, May the 5th. May the 5th this year was the 35th anniversary. They chose the signing of the Noumea Accord on the same day as the Noumea Massacre for political reasons. And so as people were celebrating the success of this military war games, there was not a Kanak to be seen on the dignitary stage. And I think that's significant because President Mapu on the record has said that he, as a member of the independence movement, rather than as a representative of the French state, still holds the spirit of the nuclear free independent Pacific movement very strong, that the movement to which he belongs is in favour of non-alignment at a time that Australia is very much aligned with the United States. He has supported the nuclear free Pacific in the very earliest days. And Australia has aligned itself within the United States in the framework of AUKUS on nuclear submarines. If it starts here, where will it end? Now, that's an issue that's been raised by other independent leaders, and I think we'll see this. The picture of the ship is HMAS Brisbane. I took it out of my hotel window last October in Noumea. You know, Australia is working very hard to rebuild the military ties that were ruptured. At the same time, the dynamics of geopolitics are swirling. President Mapu on the left, at the White House summit last year, both New Caledonia and French Polynesia, full members of the forum, went to the summit hosted by Joe Biden in the White House. You can see the two flags, the flag of Kanak and the flag of French Polynesia. President Evo Trich, second from the right, standing there. And that caused some ructions with French officials. Nicolas Metzdorf, a Conservative member who's a deputy in the French National Assembly, called out the French Foreign Minister, saying that leaving these collectivities alone with the Americans is a diplomatic error or an abandonment of sovereignty. So there's this sense that the AUKUS partners are encroaching at the time of geopolitical context. There's a lot of debate about this. Time's short, so I won't go through a lot more of this. But when I spoke to President Mapu last month, he was pretty clear. If we're talking about Indo-Pacific, I don't know about Indo. I'm focused on the Pacific. I'm preoccupied with our integration with the Pacific Islands region, which has been delayed for far too long. How does this fit into the Indo-Pacific strategy? That's the big question. Our current arrangements don't give us the flexibility, the means to advance our agenda. I've been blocked on many aspects. The complication for Paris is, I'll flash forward, things are moving in Tahiti as well. In June last year, the elections for the French National Assembly were held in Paris. French Polynesia has 3 seats, and all 3, in a stunning, unprecedented victory, were won by these 3 men, Steve Chayu, Tamatai Lagayak, and Moatai Brotherson. All members of Tavini Huirakira, pro-independence political party, long-standing party led by Oscar Temaru in Tahiti. Clean sweep, never happened before. They only held 1 seat in 2018, and yet they won all 3 seats. Tamatai Lagayak, 21 years old, new generation, youngest person ever to sit in French National Assembly, indeed. Wonderful video of him on the first day walking to work. Tavini flew his mother to Paris to present him with his lunch when he went to the National Assembly. It's a great YouTube, it's worth watching. Brotherson, the elder of the group, 53, has just been elected 2 weeks ago as president of French Polynesia. The Tavini party, pro-independence party led by Oscar Temaru, swept the board, has a 19-seat majority in the local assembly of French Polynesia, will be in office for 5 years unless there's major changes. And Brotherson has brought in a new generation of young technocrat leaders. 80% of the Tabini members in the new assembly are young people, not old political hacks. It's a generational change. And he too is saying we want to integrate in the region. He too is saying we are still French occupied territory, so we have to think about this Indo-Pacific strategy. And he's saying we understand there are big players in the region, the United States and others, but we don't want to be pawns on someone else's chessboard. We don't want to be pawns on someone else's chessboard. And that's significant. So here we are, 2 flags flying in New Caledonia at the moment. Yet the debate about political status is coming to a head. It's coming to a head at a time also that President Macron is in trouble politically. He's chewed up a lot of domestic capital with recent policy debates around pension reforms, the retirement age and so on. There was literally rioting in the streets this year, in the streets of France. His opinion poll numbers have tumbled, although he was re-elected last year as president, has a 5-year term ahead of him. Has the French government got the capacity to deliver to address this complex problem? The clock is ticking with the next local elections scheduled for the May 2024. Will those elections be held on schedule? Will they be held under the current Noumea Accord electoral rolls, or will the electoral rolls be opened up? The next few months will be interesting, and Monsieur Darmanin is on the plane on the 1st of June, I understand, unless he does a bite. Lots to discuss. Australia is obviously focused on this, and the unprecedented visit by Penny Wong makes me think that Australia realises riding 2 horses can be difficult. Thank you. I've spoken too long, but open up for your comments, for your questions, for your feedback. Thank you.
I should have mentioned at the beginning that we're recording the session. Most important point there is obviously for the discussion, because Nic didn't object to being recorded, I'm sure, being a good journalist. Can I take the chairman's prerogative and ask 3 linked questions? One, why the FLNKS are insisting on bilateral engagement with Paris? I'm not quite clear on that. Second, are the FLNKS still committed to independence completely? And third, is there going to be pressure for another referendum?
There is an internal debate within the independence movement. The FLNKS is a coalition of 4 parties, the 2 largest, Union Caledonienne, which dates back to the 1950s, and the party of Kanak Libération, Palika, formed in 1976. They have different perspectives on the way forward. Palika has talked over many years about independence in partnership, indépendance avec partenariat. And that has been interpreted in many different ways. Does that mean some sort of free association on a model, say, like the Marshall Islands or the Cook Islands, depending on New Zealand or US things? Union Caledonian continues to talk about full independence and sovereignty. Both, however, have come together in January. The Congress was held not just with the 4 members of the FLNKS, but with other pro-independence parties outside this main umbrella body, including the Labor Party, pro-independence unions from the USTPE, Trade Union Confederation, the main Protestant Church, which is many Kanak members who support independence. And that came together to set up a common negotiating position. So I'm sure behind closed doors, there are discussions about maximum and minimal positions. I'm not party to those discussions. That's why I went to try and ask people. The public position is we want to negotiate with the French state. Union Caledonian said on the record, we want a treaty with France to set out a transitional program to an independent sovereign state. And that would mean that there would be a period, transitional period after the declaration of independence. That might take 5, 10 longer years. So, for example, New Caledonia would declare its independence after a referendum or some process, but France may continue to play a role, say, in maritime surveillance or providing policing and defence, which are currently state powers, and that transitional period might continue for some time indeterminate. And that's the dialogue, as I understand it, going on with the French government at the moment. The people, once again on the record, said the reason we're talking bilaterally is we've tried to build a common destiny with people from other communities, and 3 times people have said no. And so I think the whole concept of the Noumea Accord was, when it was signed in 1998, both sides, supporters and opponents of independence, felt that the extra decades would benefit their case. The independence people felt that over time they could win over support from people of non-Indigenous heritage, of which there are many, European, people of Asian heritage, Wallisians. It's a very multicultural society in that sense. The right felt that you could create a new Kanak bourgeoisie, putting it bluntly. You could create people who are invested in the state, who benefit from the incredible amount of resources that France puts in and has put in right through the Noumea Accord process to fund education and health, teachers and so on. President Maclellan was just recently in France negotiating ongoing funding at a time of economic crisis. So there are nuances and differences, but the belief from key independence leaders is that they need to talk with France because France is the colonial power. The loyalist parties have, once again, nuances. The group of the loyalists is slightly more hardline. The Caledonia Ensemble, led by Philippe Gomez, has been more accommodating in terms of trying to negotiate a bridge between the sides. So there are nuances and differences, and I'm sorry I haven't had time to go into that. But the bottom line is that the FLNKS says we want to talk with the French because they are the colonial power and they have responsibilities as the colonial power. We can talk with others later. As I quoted, Madame Buckus said, no, we want to talk trilaterally because ultimately New Caledonians have to live together. We have to work together into the future. And that's been a key element of the Noumea Accord process. And as someone who's visited the country for more than 40 years, the polarization that existed in the 1980s was stark. And New Caledonia has radically transformed over the 25, 35 years since that time. In many ways, you see Kanaks moving into positions that they just didn't have in the 1980s. The intermarriage, there's a lot of what's called métissage, a lot of people intermarrying between ethnic communities. New Caledonians are defining themselves as New Caledonians. Many French people have left. For the first time in the 2014 to 2019 census, the population dropped, first time in 40 years. It dropped during the troubles of the 80s. And many of the people who've left, figures are a bit tricky to do because there's many New Caledonian students travelling and so on, but it looks like a lot of people of French nationality have left over the last decade because of both economic questions, because of the uncertainty about the referendums, because of the pandemic. There's been a decline, about 2,000 people a year net have left New Caledonia every year since over the last decade. And that changes the balance as well politically for voting. Complex. I'm sorry, I haven't had time to go into those nuances, but the fundamental situation is there. The final problem is what people say in public and what they say in private is different. There's a certain theatre about this. The trip backwards and forwards to Paris. There's a famous song by the band Gurujele. Nos politiques sont à Paris pour préparer avec la meilleure patrie des accords hardcore. Our leaders are backwards and forwards to Paris to create new accords. There's a political elite who are involved in these discussions, and they work together within the Congress. The big change has been President Maclellan and his government having a majority of ministers who support independence, or are part of what's called the Islander majority, majorité Oceanian, with the Wallisian party, which aren't pro-independence, but certainly willing to work with the independence bloc. And that's led to major debates over taxation, like taxing the rich, reform of public institutions that are heavily indebted, like RUA, which is a health assurance thing. There's a major debate going on about changing indebted public institutions. There are commonalities, though, amongst working people around things like trade union rights, housing, welfare policies. And on those things, people don't vote independence or not. They vote about their class interests as people, poor people. And that's, so there are things that bring people together around their interests, social, political, cultural, class, around housing, around welfare, around jobs, around employment, that aren't to do with independence. And let's not forget, many people have been living under pro-independence administrations for 30 years. The Northern Province and Loyalty Islands Province have been run by one or other FLNKS member party since the late 1980s. So many Caldoche, who I've interviewed up in the north, are people of European heritage, say, well, we've been living with these blokes for years. We know, we know what they're like. That change has been a key part of the Noumea Accord transition that has been really important compared to the bad old days of the 1980s. But the political impasse that's there now shows that the dream that the architects of the Noumea Accord would have, that people would come together, hasn't happened. And I think one of the reasons for that is, as I say, that the French state is not a neutral player in this. They have strategic interests in the context of the Indo-Pacific contest that we find ourselves in today. And that complicates the discussions that New Caledonians have to have about what sort of political future they'll make for themselves.
I'll ask first Helen Fraser, another distinguished journalist / researcher. She translated Jabal's writings some years after he died, which we published. Helen, you first and then Sinclair.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Nick, because you've managed to bring so many strands into such a comprehensive but coherent talk. I wanted to ask you, do you have any figures that might shed some light on the electoral lists? Because one of the intentions of Chris with the Noumea Accord was that it would give time for Kanak population to grow and maybe get close to the position where they could actually win the referendum. There's been obstacles, and whether France has kept its word or is likely to not keep it on the question of the separate electoral list. How do you think that's moving along?
It's complex because there are 3 different electoral lists. There is an electoral list for the institution in France, the National Assembly, the Senate, the European Parliament, and local municipalities. And that's open to all French nationals. There's a separate list for the local political institutions, the 3 provincial assemblies and the Congress. And that's a restricted electorate. It's very complex. Basically, 1998, it was frozen. And so there are many, as I said, tens of thousands of French nationals living in New Caledonia who can vote for the local municipality elections, but can't vote for the assemblies and the Congress. There's a 3rd and separate list for the referendums. Once again, a restricted electorate for New Caledonian citizens, and so on. The argument has been, can you unfreeze? They talk about a list gelé, frozen, or glissant, sliding, so the fixed date for when the cut-off was is now, 25 years ago. And there are arguments about, can you open it up all the way so every French national can vote? Or is there a sweet spot in the middle? What people say publicly and privately is complex. I interviewed people about this very question. The official position of the FLNKS is we don't want any changes before May next year. Last year, Monsieur Darmanin suggested that France might unilaterally change. That I think is not the French position at the moment. I think they realise that that would be catastrophic politically. The Loyalists, Les Loyalistes, that group with Madame Bacchus as the leader, has called for opening up completely. So once again, there are public positions, and there's a question of whether there can be a compromise on that question. When I interviewed Roch Womiton, he said that there could be no compromise on the referendum, that, you know, New Caledonians, and particularly the colonised people, must decide on that. Implicitly, does that mean he'd be open to something around the provincial elections? I don't want to put words in his mouth. I think that's indeed what these talks and negotiations going behind closed doors are all about. I got a copy of the speech that the FLNKS gave in their meeting with Prime Minister Bourne in Paris. Journalistic word. And it began in 1853. And so started in 1853, the year of colonisation, went on to 1878, the Artillery Rebellion, 1917, 1954, creation of Union Caledonia, 1984. But you got to page 6 before they talked about the current conjuncture. And I think that was a very Kanak way of saying, what's happening now is our timetable. Your timetable is we have to have a decision by May next year. Our timetable is this began in 1853 and will continue. So behind the political compromises that must be made for people, you know, to have a say in who governs them, and there is pressure to, you know, regularise that situation, there is this underlying belief from not all, but many Kanak, Indigenous Kanak, that this is their country, and their doors have been opened to the so-called victims of history. Will people walk together? As Australians, we should understand this, because this is the discussion that we are having around the voice to Parliament. That the Indigenous minority, and it is a minority in Australia, are saying, we want to walk together. You have an opportunity to vote in a referendum. Will you walk with us, or will you vote no? Sound familiar? The same challenge is posed here, is posed in many colonised nations about how the Indigenous sovereign people opens to the descendants of those who come as convicts, as indentured labourers, as migrant workers, as the public servants and teachers who come from France today to contribute to building New Caledonia. That discussion is happening. The elite political discussion is technical, but the shift, as I say, I think the tectonic shift that's happening amongst New Caledonians is, for me, more interesting. How people have come together under the Noumea Accord, how Wallisians, a younger generation of Wallisians, are now saying, our future is here in the South Pacific, it's not in France. French nationals can leave, go back to Paris, people of European heritage. We live here in the South Pacific. And what happens to Wallis if New Caledonia is independent? Like we're New Caledonian born Wallisians. So those discussions are happening around the Carver Bowl. Those discussions are happening not just in Paris at an elite level, but amongst ordinary people.
Can I say, except the ones who come from France recently, do you include them in that?
It's not neat. I think it's not neat. I have a very good friend, a progressive lefty, French born, and I asked him, would you take out a New Caledonian passport? Can you have, if they don't have dual nationality? And he was saying, well, I've got kids. If I lose my EU passport, will they have the same rights to go to Europe? So that, you know, people, it's a very human thing. People are deciding about health and education. Will welfare collapse if we don't have the money coming from Paris? Will the World Bank give us money? Will we have an Australian patrol boat or a Chinese patrol boat? I'm not joking. That's what Timor had to decide after they gained their independence. These are discussions that are happening amongst ordinary people about what happens. And the theatre of the trips to Paris, I think, obscure those shifts. And I'm not a New Caledonian. You have to ask the people in New Caledonia where they think that's going to end up.
Sinclair,
Thanks very much.
6 people who've asked questions from outside. I'll hand them over to Nic to answer quickly. We've got time until 2. The room is booked until 2. So if you don't mind kicking on.
I'll be brief too.
Thanks very much, Nic, and I hope very much that you'll write something up for DPA. We'd certainly be very interested in publishing something along those lines. I was going to ask, I guess it's a fairly obvious question, and it relates to one of the, again, very obvious changes that has taken place, which is the geopolitics. And you have touched about that, in terms of, how that's impacting in terms of, relationships within the region in particular, but, beyond the region. A fairly obvious question would be, are there any signs of how the larger geopolitics might actually infuse the politics on the ground in a manner in which we've seen in really, really interesting ways sort of playing out, say, a place like Solomon Islands, where this new dimension has been domesticated, if you like, it's been appropriated, and it's had all sorts of unpredictable sort of effects, which can be directly attributed or exclusively attributed to the sort of China factor, but which sort of works out within the layers and the complexities of domestic politics. It seems to me that this is a distinct possibility, and I was wondering if you might speculate a little bit how
it's already happened in a variety of ways. One of the long-standing markets for nickel ore exports for many, many decades was Australia. Japan and Australia for a long time were the 2 big markets. Queensland Nickel Industries bought a lot of New Caledonian ore. And in 2016, Clive Palmer closed the Townsville smelter. And it came at a very difficult time for New Caledonia because there was pressure to find new markets and so on. And now the biggest market, 2 biggest markets is China and Korea, no longer Australia and Japan. So that's over the last Noumea Accord period been a significant shift. And the Northern Province, with the Koniambo smelter, has joint venture partnerships with the Korean firm POSCO and a Chinese firm, Jinchuan, and I've written about this. I can send people the references in the book, The China Alternative. My chapter has a case study about this shift. So thanks to Clive Palmer, Australia is I think now the 11th trading partner, 9th, 11th trading partner with New Caledonia for exports. Used to be much higher because of the nickel exports. So China is a major market. And just like Australia, with China as a major market for energy, for minerals and so on, what does that mean for domestic politics? We grapple with that, so do New Caledonians. So obviously the rise of China as an economic power has had an impact, and that will continue. Secondly, though, it's played out in terms of China scare campaigns as well. I did a little exercise in the lead up to the 2021 referendum, and I looked at the French media reports. When as a reporter, I went and reported on the 2018 referendum, and there wasn't much talk of China. In 2021, I got 30 articles in the French media about the looming referendum in New Caledonia. 27 out of 30 had China either in the headline or the first paragraph. So in the space of a few years, China was no longer seen as an economic partner, but as a security threat in the French media. And the question of what would happen with the 2021 referendum was framed in the prism of the Indo-Pacific geopolitical context. And there's been allegations of, Chinese interference and things like that. So just as the way that the debate's played out in Australia, so the debate has played out in the French media, with, frankly, some scare campaigns that don't address the nuance in New Caledonia, I would argue. And a lot of it is because China is a major trading partner, and New Caledonia has a lot of nickel. And so I think looking into the 2030s, Tesla is interested, but so is China. And that will play out over time. So I think you're right that the China debate is influencing it. The other feature, of course, is, as I mentioned, President Macron announced an India Australia-France axis in the Indo-Pacific. He sees France and the European Union playing a balancing role with a certain, his words, strategic autonomy in the great contest between China and the US. Some would see France really as part of the Western alliance against China. That's contested left and right in France about the role that France should play. French think tanks write a lot about this and see, and frankly, it's like the Australian media, they don't look at the agency, cultural rights and history of New Caledonia. Everything we've been talking about today, it's all framed, a lot of the media coverage nowadays, through the geopolitical prism without acknowledging the agency and creativity. I want to acknowledge, Mr. Lefroy, New Caledonia has a delegate in Australia. There are delegates of the government of New Caledonia in a number of countries engaged in trade and commerce and dialogue and so on. So, you know, New Caledonia is reaching out to be within the region, but you're right, it is within the context of this. Small example, yesterday I published an article, New Caledonia and French Polynesia have not been invited formally to the India Forum for India-Pacific Cooperation, which will be held in Port Moresby on the 22nd. Now, New Caledonia and French Polynesia have been invited to the White House summit hosted by President Biden last year, the Parma meeting, Pacific Area Leaders meeting in Japan, 2021, and on the 29th, 30th, they've been invited to go to Seoul for the first inaugural Korea Pacific Leaders meeting. And that's because as full members of the forum, they want to be part of the forum's discussion around the 2050 Blue Pacific strategy on oceans, on climate, on trade, selling nickel to Korea, one of their second biggest market. So they want to be part of that discussion. India hasn't invited them. I've been provocative enough to suggest that that's because Monsieur Modi's heading to Paris as the guest of honor on Bastille Day, and France wants to sell him 26 Rafale fighters. We'll leave it to the geopolitical analysis to see whether that's correct. But, you know, New Caledonia, as a member of the forum, the government of New Caledonia is seeking to build ties with Australia, New Zealand, Pacific neighbours. And back to the days of Jean-Marie Chevalier, he said, our independence allows us to manage our interdependences. Independence is not autarky, it's about us managing our relationship with China, with the United States, with Australia, with our Melanesian neighbours. That's been the spirit that both France and New Caledonia, the governments of France and New Caledonia have been working towards, but it's complicated. And the unique situation we have at the moment is, for the first time ever, we have two pro-independence presidents in Papeete and Noumea will be coming to the Cook Islands Forum in November. And when the question comes up about issues, they, I would argue, are going to be presenting a slightly different nuance than if there'd been two anti-independence leaders in the room, as there has been for the last 7 years. I think we're in a new situation, and President Brotherson is going to raise a whole lot of issues that haven't been raised before on the part of French Polynesia. So Mapu and Brotherson together as a team is going to be very interesting to watch in terms of pushing the boundaries of how the French Pacific navigates this broader geopolitical contest.
Nic, how do you want to deal with these questions? Do you want to read them, or shall I read them to you? There's 7 of them. Maybe we do 3 or 4 first. Then I go here and then back
to the foyer. Yes.
Oh, yeah, if I may. Thank you very much, Nic, for your insightful presentation. And thank you for organizing this discussion. I'm the official representative of New Caledonia to Australia, and based at the French Embassy here at Nationale. So we're very happy to come back and then maybe give a talk to the students who will find out what they were having. So Nic, thank you very much for these figures. Just a point to answer, to complement the answer of Nic on the question there, is that the frozen, the electoral role will be a key a question regarding the future of its new agreement that should be signed. It's a key point because the pro-independence people are very clear that they don't want this electoral frozen core to be changed. But my understanding, I'm not a lawyer, Nick, you can correct me if I'm wrong. This electoral frozen wall was a temporary decision. It can last forever. So it was a temporary measure that was written in the Article 13 of the French Constitution. But there is a legal point that has to be, resolved there. But again, political discussion can go over legal things. But that's a question of what I wanted to bring here. And also the big difference between the three referendums. The first two referendum with a very strong participation, as Nic mentioned it, were called the referendum couperet. They were axe referendum, yes or no, very axing question. And of course, we realized that the independence people really wanted the independence after 20 years of the Noumea Agreement. But the third one was what we call a referendum éclairé, enlightened referendum with the French state, writing a document called Les conséquences du oui et du non, mostly putting under the nose of the voters what that would be the impact of the decision if you vote yes for independence or no for independence. So there was a slightly detail I wanted to bring here, but otherwise, thanks again, Nic, for your insightful presentation.
No, thank you for the clarification, because there are legal questions and political ones. A number of French nationals contested these electoral restrictions before the European Court of Human Rights, before the UN Human Rights Commission, and all bodies, the French courts, EU courts, and the UN all recognised that under certain conditions it's possible to have restrictions on who can vote in a referendum on self-determination as a matter of international law. As I said, that was recognised, particularly in the EU case, as temporary while this transition was underway, and therefore is not forever. That's where the debate, is the Noumea Accord over or not? Some people are arguing the Noumea Accord is finished at the end of the third referendum. It was over. Therefore, the temporary restrictions on voting is over. Others are arguing, no, it's not over. The Noumea Accord says if there are 3 no's, I'm shorthanding this, is much more complex. If there are 3 no's, then the parties should meet for ongoing discussions. And Mr. Chris Nutt, who was one of the key figures in drafting this, has come out just recently and said, no, it's not over. But everyone is saying there are legal situations and there are political situations. And that was said very clearly in the people I was interviewing. Both supporters and opponents of independence recognise part of this is being discussed at the level of French jurisprudence. And part of it is being discussed in the politics that any referendum on self-determination that doesn't involve the indigenous Kanak people will have questions of legitimacy and credibility. And that's a tension between who's driving this agenda and how much United Nations principles and practice of decolonisation are involved. So this is very multi-layered, and one of the problems is partly because of language and partly because I think of deliberately, these debates are invisible in Australia, by and large, in the public sphere. They're largely invisible in France in many ways. France has got some big agendas about where France is going, the metropolitan France is going, and apart from moments like the referendums, it's not high on the domestic political agenda, not high, certainly in the media in France, and many ordinary French citizens find it difficult to understand the complexities of what's going on. So the level of debate, the nuance of this is often in a frame. Can I say many ordinary New Caledonians also don't follow the nuanced details of whose position is what? I mean, as a journalist who's fascinated by this, I struggle to understand it. I've just been and interviewed a whole lot of people and got way more confused, frankly, simply because there are public and private positions, and there are nuanced positions. The other element is this is done in a cross-cultural context. And I'll take these two questions that have come in on the chat that I've asked about. Australia's talked about an Indigenous First Nations foreign policy. Australia has appointed Ambassador Jasper Mohammed as the first ambassador for First Nations. And he's working within the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade to work out what that means. I interviewed President Mapu about this last year, and he said he was fascinated by this. And this coincides with New Zealand appointing Noumea Accord, Māori woman, as the first female Māori foreign minister of New Zealand. So you have Penny Wong, talking about at the UN General Assembly in 2022, a First Nations foreign policy, Australia defining itself by its relationship with First Nations. And when I talked with President Mapu, he said, this is great. I'm so pleased that, as it was, Prime Minister Ardern, Prime Minister Wong are talking about this question. Because for us, the centre of a First Nation foreign policy is emancipation and self-determination. And I thought, I'm not quite sure that's what Penny Wong's talking about when she's talking about First Nation policy, the right to self-determination. Because as I mentioned, no Australian foreign ministers use the word decolonisation in public for more than a decade. But that's an interesting discussion because under international human rights law, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the UN Special Committee on Decolonisation, the Convention on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights, Convention on Political Rights, all of them have the right to self-determination, if not first, as a central part of that. So the definition of what self-determination means for Indigenous peoples within nation states or for countries that are classically colonised by a 19th century European power like Britain or France, I would argue. The question of self-determination is still on the regional and international agenda. You only have to look at the disunited kingdom. I say as a Maclellan, will old Caledonia move to independence as well as New Caledonia? Catalan, the Basques, this question of nationhood, statehood, sovereignty is an international debate still in the 21st century. But we are living with the last of the remaining countries listed on the UN list of non-self-governing territories. So there's a whole international jurisprudence on the right to self-determination. And I think it's interesting that the Australian government has been willing to put this on the table as they debate a referendum on a voice to Parliament. Just as New Caledonia 25 years ago moved ahead of us, as is often the case, on this. They also moved ahead of us, and I go to the next question about the status of women. France passed a loi de parité, a parity law, more than 20 years ago. That means that electoral lists have to have 50-50% men and women. And to avoid having the men at the top and the women at the bottom, you have what's called a zipper clause, where you have man, woman, man, woman, man, woman, woman, man, woman, man on the electoral list. And by mathematics, nearly half the Congress are women. 46% of the Congress in New Caledonia at the moment are women. Now that's unprecedented in Melanesian politics, where countries like Vanuatu, PNG, Solomons have a terrible record of getting women into political office. Women play a crucial role in civil society, in the churches, in peacemaking, in all sorts of ways, but are not represented in equal ways. Everyone talks about Hilda Heine of the Marshall Islands, the first elected, leader of Pacific State. Not true. Murray Noel Temerow, 2004 president, and Dewi Garode, vice president. New Caledonia had a female president and vice president in 2004 based on this movement. So there is a strong representation of women. The new vice president of French Polynesia, just chosen a couple of days ago, is a woman alongside President Brotherton. So women have played a much greater role in the public sphere in New Caledonia and French Polynesia and Wallis because of this French law, compared to many Pacific Island countries. And that's seen, I think, in really interesting ways in policy terms, people addressing issues around violence against women, around housing, around welfare programs and so on. That is, in some ways, I would argue, more advanced in the debate than we see in other places. So there was a question related to that, and I think it is significant. The question was, is it significant? I don't think it is. At the time, there was some resistance from men, including Kanak men, to this notion. And there was even a debate about the role of women in the Sénat coutumier, the customary Senate that was created. These are chiefs that are chosen through the 8 customary regions, 2 for each region. There was a very interesting speech by the late Nidosh Nesseline, a chief from Mare, because he was asked, why can't women be on the Senate? And he says, well, I've got no objection to that because the customary Senate is a colonial construct anyway. It's not really reflecting our chiefly values. So why not women on there? Which was an interesting way of framing the question. But there is a vibrant civil society in New Caledonia. Women in New Caledonia face the same plague of violence in the home, in the workplace, in the community as women across the Pacific. But they're active around it, and there are incredible role models of leadership now after, 20 years of women playing a much greater role in public leadership and parliamentary leadership.
And there's one more question over here.
Sorry.
Yeah, Nic, either for you or for Dr. McCoy. Pursuant to the moderate political situation which has taken place over the last couple of decades, has France seen fit to alter the numbers and strength of its armed forces in either New Caledonia or French Polynesia?
There have been deployments at particular times where there have been increases. For example, before the 2021 referendum, there was a significant deployment of police and military forces. I think 2,500, I had to check the figures, but per capita, quite a large number. And that was presented by the French government as to maintain the context for a secure and stable referendum. Was seen by many independence activists as a provocation against them. Different perspectives, obviously, from different sides of the debate. France is seeking to modernise some of the naval forces deployed. Just a month or so ago, a new patrol boat was deployed and based in Noumea, particularly for maritime surveillance and for humanitarian disaster response. The patrol boat that replaced was built in 1983, which is older than some people in the room. So that's a sign. France, I think, I don't have time to go into this, unfortunately, but one of the things about AUKUS for me was that the Americans decided that France really doesn't bring much to the table in terms of military firepower in the Pacific. It has both forces of sovereignty and forces deployed for particular moments. But there are a few aging frigates, some patrol boats, some Guardian aircraft, which are used for maritime surveillance, and so on. Provide valuable services for cyclone relief, for maritime surveillance, and so on. France, Australia, and New Zealand have a treaty that dates back, I think, to 1992 called the France Agreement, which is a crucial mechanism to ally and have worked together. For example, when Tonga had its volcano, last year, they worked together. France led, in fact, the deployment of humanitarian support for Tonga. So those forces are significant. But when it comes to the big geopolitical context, the vessels that France has deployed or the aircraft come from France. The Jeanne d'Arc deployment is sent around the world every year or two. There's one currently underway at the moment, but these are vessels that come from Toulon and so on, and circumnavigate or come to Singapore and back to be involved in military exercises all the way around the region, but they're not deployed in the region. So not a lot. And that's one of the questions about the final step. In fact, one of the state powers, the compétence régalienne, that's being discussed in this referendum is who runs the military. And I think the FLNKS has talked about this transitional period after a declaration of independence, where overnight it won't happen that there'll be an army. In fact, some people don't want an army; they might want a police force on the model that Vanuatu has, rather than an army on the Fiji Papua New Guinea model. So these debates are going on. I just say that people often forget in the Indo-Pacific debates that there is some bad blood around the role of the French army during the Troubles in the 80s. And many people haven't forgotten that in the Kanak community, even though it's often invisible in the public debate nowadays. The memory of what happened in the 80s is still strong. And that's a contention. And indeed, at moments of social crisis, young Kanak troublemakers are very good at throwing stones at policemen. They're often not around independence questions, but around social debates on environment or housing and things like that. Disruption around the nickel industry. There have been fights between trade unionists and police forces. And there's an unhealthy relationship, I'd argue, amongst many Kanak youth with the police deployed from France, as well as the local municipal police and so on.
We've gone a long way over time, and I apologise for anybody that was online that didn't get the question answered. For a mere journalist who can understand how to footnote, I think Nic has a depth of knowledge that is reflected here today. We wrote a piece together before the Bougainville referendum about issues, comparing the issues between Bougainville and New Caledonia. I think we've got another paper to write about post-referendum processes and decision-making, because there's a number of parallels and some significant differences between what's happening in Bougainville now and New Caledonia. And they're both situations that have very few parallels elsewhere in the world. So some really interesting paths being made here in the Pacific. Nic, thank you very much for making the effort to come. You're always able to elucidate the situation way beyond anybody else that I'm aware of. So thank you.
Can I put in a plug? Department of Pacific Affairs kindly published a paper I wrote about Kanak oceanic diplomacy around maritime boundary disputes. There's some copies here for those in the room, and you can download it online from the ANU. If I can put in a plug. Thank you for all those people who've joined us on Zoom. Sorry to talk too much. See you again.